When was the last time you had to choose between pride and hunger? In the cold heart of a Montana winter, a young widow stood outside a general store, clutching an empty basket, not because she'd forgotten her money, but because no one in town would give her a chance to pay later. She was denied, judged, and quietly shamed for daring to survive after losing everything. If it were you, would you beg for mercy or walk away with your head held high? Even as your stomach turned empty, she chose the latter. Until a stranger appeared, a cowboy, calm and steady, eyes like the horizon itself. He said just one thing: "Ride with me. I'll fill your table tonight." But could she trust him when kindness has burned you before? When hope feels like a trap, would you let your guard down again? Or let the cold wind take your last chance at warmth? This isn't just a story about a meal. It's about a woman learning to trust again, and a man discovering that goodness still has a place in a world full of dust and doubt. Tonight, we'll ride with them. Join me, for Cowboy saw her denied at the store, whispered, "Ride with me. I'll fill your table tonight." If you still believe kindness can warm even the harshest winter, please like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts, where the wild frontier still holds stories worth keeping alive. The wind off the Beartooth Range carried the smell of snow long before the first flakes began to fall. It slid down the narrow streets of Red Willow, whipping through gaps between the false fronts of the saloon and the dry goods store. Inside that store, the stove burned low, but the tone of the man behind the counter burned colder still. "I said no more credit. Mrs. Whitmore," he barked. "You already owe for flour and beans." Clara Whitmore kept her chin level. The basket in her hand was light, too light. She had hoped to fill it with a sack of cornmeal, maybe a strip of salt pork if the Lord was kind. "I'll pay after the thaw," she said quietly. "You'll have it before spring drives the herds north." The shopkeeper turned his back. Promises don't keep ledgers. Conversation in the store fell away. Someone coughed. Clara felt the weight of eyes on her worn shawl, on the frayed hem of her dress. She could have begged. She'd done that once, years ago, and the shame had lasted longer than hunger ever did. So she only nodded, turned, and stepped out into the wind. Outside, the sky hung low and pewter gray. Snow dusted the hitching posts and the backs of waiting horses. Her boots crunched against the hard dirt as she crossed the porch. The cold bit deep, but pride bit deeper. Across the street, a man leaned against a corral rail, his hat pulled low, a coat the color of saddle dust draped across his shoulders. He had the stillness of someone who'd seen storms come and go without flinching. Their eyes met for half a breath. "You got turned away for food," he said, voice steady, not unkind. Clara stiffened. "I'll manage." He studied her for a moment longer, then pushed off the rail. "No doubt you will, but it's near dark, and that wind's carrying ice." He paused, thumb hooked in his belt. "Ride with me. I'll fill your table tonight." The words caught her like a sudden gust, simple, certain, dangerous. "I don't take charity." "It isn't charity," he said. "It's supper." Behind him, his horse stamped and blew a white cloud into the chill. Clara hesitated, fingers tightening around the handle of her empty basket. Somewhere beyond town, her son Liam waited in their small cabin by the creek, likely poking at the embers to keep them alive. He'd eaten little more than half a biscuit that morning. "Please," the man added softly, "let me help." She studied him then, the way snow clung to the edge of his coat, the calm in his eyes. Not pity, just a quiet knowing. "What's your name?" she asked. "Harlan Cole." He tipped his hat once. "Yours, Clara Whitmore." "Well, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, adjusting the reins. "You can ride up front, or I'll follow your wagon." For a moment she fought with herself, the long habit of refusing help against the small voice that whispered she couldn't do this alone anymore. Then she exhaled. My boy's at home, out by Miller's Creek. Then that's where we'll go. The wagon creaked as she climbed aboard. Harlan took the seat beside her, setting the horse into a steady trot. Snow began to fall in earnest, small white threads unraveling from the gray sky. They didn't speak for a while. The sound of the wheels and the steady rhythm of hooves filled the silence. Clara kept her hands folded in her lap, eyes on the dim road ahead. Every mile stretched thin between gratitude and fear. After a while, Harlan spoke. You got far to the creek 3 miles. He nodded. Enough time for the stew to thaw if we hurry. She glanced at him then. You planned on feeding someone tonight? A half smile touched his mouth. Didn't know who until now. The road narrowed where the creek curved close to the hills. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke from distant cabins. When they reached her place, Clara's throat tightened. The cabin leaned slightly, one shutter hanging crooked. Smoke barely rose from the chimney. Liam burst from the doorway, barefoot, hair a tousled mess. "Mama," he shouted, then stopped when he saw the stranger. "It's all right," Clara said, stepping down. "This is Mr. Cole. He's come to help." Harlan tipped his hat to the boy. "Evening, son. You like rabbit stew?" Liam's eyes widened. "You got rabbit." "I've got more than that," Harlan said, swinging open the wagon's tailgate. He unloaded a small sack of potatoes, a pouch of beans, and a wrapped cut of venison. Clara felt her knees weaken. "Mr. Cole." He shook his head. "Let's get the fire going first." Inside. The cabin was dim, its single lamp flickering. The hearth sat cold, but soon the flames caught, painting the walls in warm amber. Harlan moved with quiet certainty, chopping, stirring, setting the pot to hang. The smell of broth filled the room, thick and rich. Liam's laughter broke the silence as the cowboy showed him how to turn the spoon without spilling. Clara watched, unsure which hurt more, the emptiness she'd grown used to, or the sudden flood of warmth she feared might fade. When the stew finally simmered, she served 3 bowls. For the first time in months, they ate until full. Later, when the boy had curled under his quilt, Harlan stepped outside. Snow whispered against the roof. Clara followed him to the porch. "You didn't have to stop," she said quietly. He looked toward the dark hills. No one should have to face a Montana winter hungry. She searched his profile in the half-light. "You don't even know us." He turned then, his gaze steady. "I don't need to." For a long breath, neither moved. Then he touched the brim of his hat. "Good night, Mrs. Whitmore." She watched him walk to his horse, boots crunching in the snow, and disappear down the frozen road. The night closed in again, but this time it carried a promise instead of emptiness. Morning came slow to the Whitmore cabin, carrying with it the faint pink light of dawn and the bitter sting of frost. Clara woke before the sun crested the ridge, as she always did, pulling her shawl tight and stirring the embers in the hearth until they caught. The stew pot from last night still hung over the coals. For a moment, the scent made her heart twist, proof that what had happened wasn't a dream. She stepped onto the porch. The snow stretched in soft drifts down the lane, untouched except for one clear set of tracks, hoofprints leading away toward town. He had really been there. Liam padded out behind her, rubbing his eyes. Was that man an angel? Mama Clara smiled faintly. No, love, just a cowboy with good manners. He said he'd come back. She hesitated. No, he didn't. But even as she said it, she found herself watching the road as if she half expected the outline of a horse cresting the hill. It was foolish, she told herself. Men like him didn't circle back. By midday, she had washed the dishes, patched a tear in Liam's trousers, and convinced herself that the quiet of the cabin was safer that way. Then, just as she set a bucket beneath the pump, she heard its steady hoofbeats, slow and sure. The shape coming down the lane was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, coat dark with frost, the easy rhythm of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. Harlan Cole swung down from his horse and tied the reins to the post. His breath came in white plumes. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to be standing in her yard again. Clara stared for a heartbeat too long. "You found your way back." "I did," he said. "Road's rough past the creek, but the mare didn't mind." Liam came barreling out, excitement chasing the chill. "Mr. Cole." "We still got stew left," Harlan grinned. "Then I came at the right time." Inside, the warmth of the fire seemed to welcome him as easily as Liam did. Clara poured coffee into a cracked mug and set it before him. He nodded his thanks, hands wrapped around the cup like it was something sacred. "You fix fences yourself?" he asked, nodding toward the sagging rails outside the window. "When they break," she replied. "I can take a look. Looks like a deer came through. There's no need." "There's need," he interrupted gently, already shrugging out of his coat. "Just point me toward your tools." It went against every grain of her pride, but she found herself showing him anyway. While he worked, she sat by the window mending shirts, pretending not to glance up every few minutes. Through the glass, she watched him move steady, deliberate. No wasted effort. The kind of man who didn't rush even when the cold bit through the air. Liam followed him around like a shadow, handing nails, asking questions. Harlan answered every one with patience, showing the boy how to twist the wire taut, how to check the line for sag. By midday, the fence stood straight again, a clean line against the snow. When he came in, there was mud on his boots and a thin scrape across his forearm. Clara fetched a cloth before he could protest. "You should clean that. It's nothing." "It'll be something if it festers," she said, dipping the cloth in warm water. He sat, letting her tend the scrape. The room went quiet except for the pop of the fire. When she was done, he said softly, "You got good land here. Water close by, trees for shelter. Most folks would trade for half that." "It was my husband's," she said. "He built it when we came up from Kansas 5 years ago." Harlan nodded, eyes lowered. He passed 2 winters back. Fever took him fast. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was respectful. After a moment, Harlan said, "I buried my ma near Laramie. She liked the wind there, said it kept her honest." Clara looked up at him. "And your father gone before I could remember him." He gave a small shrug. "After Ma, it was just me." She folded the cloth, voice barely above a whisper. "You've been alone a long time." He looked toward the window where Liam's wooden toy horse sat on the sill. "Most folks are. They just don't admit it." The truth of that landed between them like a shared memory. That afternoon, he rode into town for supplies. Before leaving, he said, "You don't owe me anything." "Mrs. Whitmore." "I know," she said. "That's not why I'm coming back." The words lingered long after the sound of his horse faded down the road. When he returned before dusk, the wagon carried a small crate. He set it down beside the porch, found window glass at the smithy. "Fellow owed me a favor." Clara blinked. "You traded for that." "Had a pair of spare stirrups I didn't need." "I can't accept." He lifted a hand to stop her. "Keep it wrapped till spring. No sense fixing pains while the ground's frozen." From inside came the sound of Liam's laughter as he tugged kindling through the door. "I finished the wood. Mr. Cole." Harlan crouched to meet the boy's eyes. "You haul it yourself?" "Yes, sir. In a sack. Next time, twist the top and tie it off. Stops the splinters from catching." Liam nodded quickly, proud of the advice. Clara watched from the doorway. Her heart caught somewhere between gratitude and unease. That evening, they ate together again. stew stretched thin with turnips and hope. Harlan fixed an old harness by the fire while Clara stitched beside him. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was the quiet of people learning to breathe in the same room. After Liam went to bed, she spoke softly. "You ever think about settling somewhere for good?" He didn't look up from the leather strap. "I did once, north of Cheyenne. Landowner ran out of gold and promises. Sold the place out from under me. I'm sorry." He paused, knife still in hand. "Don't be. Sometimes losing something keeps you honest." They both laughed, quietly, the sound small but real. Outside, the wind rose, shaking the window panes. Clara shivered, pulling her shawl tighter. Harlan stood, added another log to the fire, and said, "If it gets worse, I'll sleep in the lean-to. Keep an eye on the roof." "There's no need," she said. "There's always need when snow starts talking to the eaves," he replied, eyes warm. For a long moment, they just stood there, the fire painting shadows across their faces. Something in her chest loosened. A space she hadn't realized had gone hollow. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Cole?" He met her gaze evenly. "Because someone should have, a long time ago." Clara turned away before he could see her eyes fill. She busied herself with the dishes, but her hands shook. She had spent years keeping her world small, believing that safety came from silence. Yet here was a man who said little and somehow spoke to every part of her that still hoped. That night, as she lay beside her sleeping boy, the sound of the wind outside mixed with the faint creak of the barn door and the steady rhythm of Harlan's boots pacing once before quieting. For the first time in a long while, she slept without fear, and when morning came, the world outside their cabin was blanketed in white, and the tracks leading away were joined by another set proof that someone had decided to stay close. By late morning, the snow had thinned to a light dusting, soft as flour shaken from a sieve. Clara stood by the window, watching sunlight glint off the drifts that blanketed the yard. She hadn't heard Harlan stir yet, but she knew he was out there. The faint sound of an axe echoed from behind the cabin, steady, rhythmic. Each strike carried through the cold air like a heartbeat. She wrapped her shawl tighter and stepped outside. Harlan was splitting logs near the barn, sleeves rolled up, breath steaming in the frigid air. The pile beside him had already grown knee-high. "You'll wear yourself out," she called. He paused, wiped his brow with the back of his arm, and smiled. "Wouldn't be the first time. Wood's dry enough to make a decent burn. Thought I'd get ahead of the cold." Clara hesitated before stepping closer. "You don't have to keep doing this. I know." He sank the axe into another round of pine. "But I like the work. Reminds me I'm still good for something." There was something in his tone that caught her off guard, a hint of sadness beneath the steadiness. For a moment, she wanted to ask what ghosts he carried, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she said softly, "Liam and I were going to make cornbread. You're welcome to stay for supper." He glanced up, that half-smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. I'd be a fool to turn that down. By afternoon, the air inside the cabin was thick with the smell of baking and wood smoke. Liam chattered endlessly about a snow fort he wanted to build, and Harlan listened like a man who had all the time in the world. When he spoke, it was with that same calm cadence. "If you stack the snow just right, it'll hold till the sun says otherwise." Clara laughed quietly from the hearth. "He'll take that as gospel, you know." "Good," Harlan said. "A man ought to start learning from someone who's built a few walls." Later, when the cornbread came out of the oven, golden and crisp, they ate by lamplight. Harlan's hands dwarfed the tin cup he held, and Liam hung on every word as he told stories of driving cattle through rain that stung like needles, of crossing rivers half frozen, of sleeping under stars so bright they burned holes in the dark. Did you ever get scared? The boy asked. Plenty of times, Harlan admitted. But fear's like a wild horse. You don't get rid of it. You just learn how to ride it straight. Clara watched him as he spoke, his voice steady, his eyes gentle when they fell on the boy. It stirred something inside her, something she had buried after years of disappointment and loss. When supper was done, Liam drifted off to sleep beside the fire, his head resting on Harlan's old coat. The sight of it, her son trusting so completely, filled her with both warmth and ache. She turned toward Harlan, her voice low. He hasn't laughed like that in months. Kids don't forget how, he said. They just wait for someone to give them reason. The quiet that followed was different from before. Not heavy, but alive with things neither of them dared to say. Outside, the wind howled through the eaves, and somewhere distant, a coyote's cry echoed across the frozen fields. You should sleep, Harlan said finally. I'll take the lean-to again. You'll freeze out there. He shook his head. I've had worse. But she noticed, just before he stepped out, the way he lingered in the doorway as if he wanted to say more. He didn't. He only tipped his hat and disappeared into the night. The next morning brought pale sunlight and a new problem. From the hill above the cabin, 2 riders appeared, their horses crunching through the snow. Clara's stomach tightened. She recognized one of them, Deputy Briggs, a man who never delivered good news. He dismounted at her gate. Morning, Mrs. Whitmore, he said, though the politeness didn't reach his eyes. Heard you got company out this way. Harlan stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. That'd be me. Briggs's gaze moved from him to Clara. Didn't realize you two were acquainted. We're not, Clara said quickly. Mr. Cole just helped with the fence. Briggs smirked. Word around town says otherwise. Folks don't take kindly to strangers shacking up with widows. Harlan's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. Folks ought to mind their own fires if they want them to stay warm. The deputy's eyes narrowed. You talk smart. Cowboy. That can get a man in trouble here. Clara stepped between them. That's enough. Deputy, if you've got business, say it. Briggs tipped his hat with a mock bow. Just thought you should know, Mrs. Whitmore. Some folks don't forget who your husband was, or what he did. She froze. The color drained from her face. Come on, the other rider muttered, tugging Briggs's sleeve. Let's go. It's too cold for trouble. The 2 men turned their horses and rode off, leaving silence in their wake. Clara stood rooted, breath shallow, eyes on the trail of hoofprints fading into snow. Harlan approached slowly. You all right? She nodded, but her voice shook. They're right. You know, my husband, he wasn't who folks think he was. You don't owe me explanations. Yes, I do, she said, turning toward him, anger rising from somewhere old and deep. You should know what kind of woman you've been wasting your kindness on. My husband robbed a freight train. He killed a man, and I stayed with him until the law came knocking. That's who I am to this town. Harlan didn't flinch. He studied her face, the tears she refused to let fall. And what are you to yourself? Clara. She blinked, taken aback. I don't. You stayed alive. You kept your boy fed. You built this place with your own hands. That's what I see. The words hit harder than she expected. For years she had carried her past like a stone in her chest. Now, standing before him, she felt it shift. But pride was a stubborn thing. You don't know what you're saying. The town will turn on anyone who stands near me. Let them, he said simply. I've stood in worse storms. Clara looked at him, really looked, and saw not pity, but conviction. The kind of steadiness that made the world tilt toward hope. She turned away before her voice could betray her. You should go before this turns on you, too. I'm not much for running, he said, his tone quiet but unyielding. That night, she sat by the fire long after Liam had fallen asleep, staring into the flames until her eyes burned. Outside, she heard the faint creak of the barn door and knew he was still out there, keeping watch. She told herself it didn't matter, that his kindness would pass, like every good thing had before. Yet, when the wind howled and the rafters groaned, she whispered into the darkness, "Please, stay." The words slipped out like breath, carried on the same wind that had first brought him to her. And though she couldn't see him, she felt certain that somewhere in the cold, Harlan Cole heard. The next morning dawned in a blur of gray. The snow had stopped, but the world outside still looked like it had been carved from silence. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, and Clara stirred it back to life with the iron poker. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and stew, comforting, familiar, but heavy with the weight of unspoken things. She heard boots crunch outside before the door opened. Harlan stepped in, dusting snow from his coat. "Barn's holding steady," he said, voice calm. "Roof'll need patching when it thaws, but it'll keep." "Thank you," she murmured, not turning from the hearth. He studied her for a long moment. "You didn't sleep. Neither did you." He smiled faintly. "Guess we're both stubborn." Clara set the poker aside. "You shouldn't have to be." "I told you last night," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm not going anywhere because a few folks in town like to hear themselves talk." Her voice came sharper than she meant. "They're not just talking, they're judging, and they'll come for you next." Harlan took off his hat and set it on the table. "Then they'll find I don't scare easy." She looked at him, really looked at the lines etched by sun and time, the steadiness in his eyes that made her both comforted and uneasy. "Why," she asked softly, "why are you doing this?" He met her gaze without flinching. "Because you deserve peace, and that boy deserves a man who doesn't walk away." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Clara had to turn away to hide how deeply they struck. Later that day, the sky darkened again, clouds dragging low over the hills. The temperature dropped so suddenly that the horses in the pasture stamped and snorted in protest. Liam was helping Harlan stack firewood when the wind began to rise. Snow whipped across the yard, fine and fast, and within minutes visibility vanished into a blur of white. "Inside, both of you," Clara shouted over the howl. Harlan grabbed the boy's hand and pulled him through the drifts. By the time they reached the porch, the snow was knee-deep, swirling like smoke around their legs. Once inside, the storm hit in full. The windows rattled, and the doorframe groaned against the pressure. Harlan dropped the latch and pushed the table closer to the hearth. "We'll ride it out," he said. Clara gathered blankets, her heart pounding faster than the wind outside. She hated storms the way they reminded her of that night 2 winters ago, when her husband had left and never come back, when men had come pounding on her door at dawn to tell her he was dead. Now, as thunder rolled distant and low, she sat near the fire, trembling. Harlan crouched beside her. "You all right?" She nodded, but her eyes betrayed her. "It's just storms take me back." He said nothing, only reached out, his rough hand brushing her sleeve. "You're safe now." For the first time, she didn't pull away. Hours passed. The wind roared, then softened, then rose again. Liam fell asleep under a pile of quilts, his head resting on Harlan's coat. At some point, Clara stood and went to the window. Beyond the frost-glazed glass, the world had disappeared, just whiteness and the sound of the storm breathing against the house. "I used to think the wind was trying to tell me something," she said quietly. Harlan looked up from where he sat. "What's that?" "That it never stays. That everything it touches, it leaves behind." He rose slowly, walked to stand beside her. "Maybe it's not leaving things behind." he said. Maybe it's just carrying stories forward. Yours, mine, everyone's. She turned toward him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. You really believe that I have to, he said. Otherwise, there's nothing worth fighting for. The words settled deep in her chest. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer. The town will never forgive what my husband did. Harlan's eyes held hers, steady. Then we don't ask them to. We just live decent and let time do the rest. A quiet beat passed between them, the kind that stretches not from awkwardness but understanding. Then, without thinking, Clara reached for his hand. He didn't move, didn't speak, just closed his fingers around hers, slow and sure. For the first time since she'd buried her husband, she felt warmth not born from fire. By morning, the storm had eased. The world outside shimmered with new snow, soft and unbroken. Harlan stepped outside to check the barn while Clara fried the last of the cornmeal cakes. The air smelled faintly sweet, and the sound of Liam's laughter filled the cabin as he fed kindling into the fire. When Harlan returned, his cheeks were raw from the cold, but his eyes were bright. Roof held fine, he said, stamping the snow from his boots. And your hens are still alive. Mean little things. But they made it. Clara laughed, surprised at herself. They've got spirit. Maybe they caught it from you. I doubt it, he said, smiling. I'm not near as feisty. Liam darted toward him, holding up a small carving Harlan had made a horse, its legs a little uneven but full of life. You made this? Harlan nodded. Thought you could use company when the snow's too deep to go outside. Clara watched the two of them together, the way her son looked at Harlan like he was something close to invincible. She felt that familiar ache again, half fear, half hope. But before she could speak, there was a knock at the door. Harlan's smile faded. He reached for his hat. Instinct sharp. Clara froze. The knock came again. Heavier this time. She opened the door to find Deputy Briggs standing there, his coat dusted with snow. Morning, he said curtly. Town council wants a word with you, Mrs. Whitmore. What for? He glanced past her to Harlan. Word's been going around that this man's been staying here. Folks are saying things that don't sit right. Clara's voice hardened. If they've got something to say, they can say it to me. Careful, ma'am, Briggs warned. Some of those folks sit on the church board. They're calling it indecent. Harlan stepped forward, his tone quiet but firm. You tell those folks a man's worth isn't measured by gossip. Briggs's mouth twisted. You talk pretty for someone who drifts through other people's lives. Maybe that's why you don't stay long anywhere. Something flashed in Harlan's eyes, pain, anger, maybe both. But he said nothing. Briggs turned and left, his boots crunching through the snow until the sound disappeared down the lane. Clara closed the door, her hands trembling. He'll be back. Let him, Harlan said. They can't take what we don't give them. She stared at him, her pulse unsteady. You don't understand how this town works. Harlan, once they've decided who you are, there's no changing it. He looked at her gently. Then maybe it's time someone tried. The fire popped behind them, throwing sparks that caught the air. Liam ran over and grabbed Harlan's hand, his small fingers curling tight around the rough leather of his glove. You'll stay? Right, the boy asked. Harlan knelt so they were eye to eye. As long as your mama says I can. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to say no to protect them both from the weight of rumors and memory, but the word caught in her chest. Then stay, she whispered. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the snow. For a fleeting second, it felt like spring might actually come. The thaw came slowly that year, creeping in like an uninvited guest. The snow along the creek turned gray, and water began to whisper under the thin crust of ice. Life in Red Willow stirred again. Wagons rattling down Main Street, smoke rising from chimneys, gossip flowing as freely as the meltwater. Clara tried to ignore it. She busied herself with chores, patching clothes, sweeping floors, tending to the small plot behind the cabin that would soon be ready for planting. Yet, no matter how hard she worked, she couldn't quiet the unease curling inside her. Harlan had stayed. Just as he'd promised, he fixed the roof, mended the barn door, and taught Liam how to shape wooden pegs for fence rails. His presence filled the space that had long been hollow, but it also drew eyes. When Clara ventured into town for flour, conversation hushed around her. The shopkeeper's polite smile felt strained. Even the preacher's wife, Mrs. Turner, who once offered warm greetings, now avoided her gaze. It wasn't until she caught two women whispering near the post office words like sin and example for the boy that she realized how cruel silence could be. That night, she sat by the window after Liam had gone to bed. Harlan was outside, sharpening tools by lantern light. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone carried through the still air. She watched the faint glow move across his shoulders and wondered how a man could carry himself with such peace when the world insisted on finding fault. When he came inside, she spoke softly. "They're talking again." He didn't pretend not to understand. "Let them talk." "It's not that simple," she said. "This town has long memory and short mercy." Harlan set down the whetstone and met her eyes. "You think I care what they say? I think you should," she replied, voice rising. "You could leave, find work where no one knows me, where no one." He crossed the room in 2 strides, his tone steady but firm. "And leave you to fight alone." "No." "Clara." She turned away, tears hot behind her eyes. "You don't know what that costs." "Maybe not," he said, "but I know what it's worth." For a moment neither moved. The only sound was the crackle of the fire, the quiet breathing between two people standing too close and still not close enough. He took her hand then, rough fingers brushing the back of hers. "You spent years surviving. Let someone help you live." Her breath caught. It wasn't a plea, or even a promise. It was a truth she could no longer deny. The next day, a new test came. Deputy Briggs arrived again. This time with 2 men from town, Mr. Turner, the preacher's brother, and a rancher named Cale Morris. They rode up to the cabin just as Clara was drawing water from the well. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore," Briggs called, his tone too casual. "We'd like a word with Mr. Cole." Harlan stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "You found him." Turner cleared his throat. "We're here on behalf of the town board. There's concern about appearances. Folks don't take kindly to a man sharing quarters with a widow and her boy." Harlan's gaze didn't waver. "There's nothing indecent about keeping company with good people." Cale Morris spat into the snow. "You're making a fool of yourself. Cole, you want a woman. Get yourself one that's clean." Before Clara could stop herself, she slapped him across the face. The sound cracked through the cold air. Silence followed, thick, stunned, electric. Morris's hand twitched toward his belt, but Harlan stepped forward, his voice like steel. "Don't." Briggs raised both hands. "All right, enough. No one's drawing iron here." He turned to Harlan. "You're just stirring up trouble. Leave before it gets worse." "I've been asked to leave plenty of places," Harlan said, "but this time I've got reason to stay." Briggs narrowed his eyes. "You sure about that?" Harlan glanced at Clara, then nodded. "I'm sure." The men rode off without another word, their silhouettes cutting dark shapes against the fading snow. Clara stood frozen, her hand still trembling from the slap. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. "Maybe not," Harlan replied. "But it felt right." That night, the wind returned, howling low through the trees, carrying with it the scent of thawing earth. Harlan sat by the fire, repairing the strap on Liam's boots. Clara watched him from across the room, her heart full and uneasy. "You didn't have to defend me like that," she said finally. He didn't look up. "I didn't defend you. I defended what's decent." Clara crossed her arms, fighting the warmth rising in her chest. "You'll make enemies. I've had worse. You'll make me one of them." He set the boot down and looked at her, eyes soft. "No. I'll make you a partner, if you'll have me." Her breath faltered. "Harlan, I mean it," he said quietly. "I don't have much to give, no land. No title, but I've got 2 good hands and a heart that's tired of wandering. I could build something here. With you." For a long moment, she said nothing. The fire threw shadows on the walls, flickering like ghosts of the past she'd carried too long. Then, slowly, she nodded. "If we do this, it has to be honest. No hiding." Harlan smiled, small and certain. "Honest suits me fine. Outside." The night deepened, but the light inside the cabin glowed warmer than it had in years. In the days that followed, the town's whispers grew louder. Yet something in Clara shifted. She stopped bowing her head when she walked down Main Street. She held Harlan's arm openly when they passed through the square. It wasn't defiance, it was peace. One afternoon, as spring sunlight melted the last of the frost, the preacher's wife crossed the street to meet her. "You'll ruin your good name," the woman hissed. Clara smiled, steady and calm. "I lost that long ago. I'm busy building a better one." By early April, Harlan had added a small porch to the cabin and repaired the chicken coop. Liam followed him everywhere, learning how to measure wood and test nails by sound. And for a while, the world seemed almost kind, until the night of the fire. It started near the barn, flames licking up the side like orange fingers. Clara woke to the crackle and Liam's scream. Harlan was already out the door, hauling buckets from the well. The wind fanned the blaze fast, the heat fierce enough to blister the air. "Stay with Liam," Harlan shouted. But Clara didn't listen. She grabbed another bucket and ran beside him. The two worked in desperate rhythm, throwing water until their arms burned. Sparks caught her shawl, and Harlan tore it off before it could flame. By dawn, the barn was gone, but the cabin still stood. The livestock were safe. They had lost only wood and hay. Harlan collapsed onto the frozen ground, breathing hard. "Wasn't an accident," he said. "I saw the tracks. Someone poured lamp oil along the side." Clara stared at the blackened ruin, her heart hammering. "They mean to drive us out." He looked at her, ash streaking his face, eyes fierce and bright. "Then they'll learn we're not the kind that scares easy." And though her hands still trembled, Clara found herself believing him. The smell of smoke lingered for days. It clung to the earth, to the porch railings, to Clara's hair no matter how many times she washed it. The barn was nothing but blackened ribs now, standing crooked against the pale sky. When she closed her eyes, she could still hear the hiss of steam, the crackle of burning wood, the sound of Harlan's voice calling her name through the smoke. Liam followed her everywhere that morning, silent and watchful. His small hand kept finding hers, as if afraid she might disappear like the barn had. "Will they come back?" he asked. Clara hesitated before answering. "They might, but we'll be ready this time." Harlan was already out by the ruins, sleeves rolled, shovel in hand, clearing the debris. The lines of his face looked sharper in the cold light, jaw set with quiet fury. She brought him coffee, still hot from the stove. He took it without looking up. "They used lamp oil," he said. "Same kind we keep in the shed. Barrel's gone." Her heart sank. So they came close, too close. He nodded, gaze hard on the ground. "They wanted us to see it burn. Fear's a cleaner weapon than a gun." Clara looked toward the town road. Briggs, maybe. Maybe someone he stirred up. A man like that doesn't light fires, he just hands out the matches. For a long moment neither spoke. Then she said quietly, "You could still leave. Harlan, no one would blame you." He turned toward her, eyes steady. "I already stayed once when I didn't have to. I'm not changing my mind because cowards can't mind their own peace." Something in her chest broke and mended all at once. She didn't argue again. That afternoon, neighbors came 2 ranch hands from the next valley over. They brought spare boards and a sack of feed, said they'd heard what happened. One of them, a broad man named Ellis, spat into the dirt and muttered, "Town's been talking too much and working too little." Harlan shook his hand. "Appreciate it." Clara made biscuits and coffee for the men. For a brief while, the sound of hammers replaced the memory of flames. It wasn't much, but it felt like defiance. When evening came and the others rode off, the 3 of them stood together at the edge of what used to be the barn. Harlan looked tired but satisfied. "It's a start," he said. Liam tugged his sleeve. "Can I help tomorrow?" Harlan smiled and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You already did, son." The word hung in the air, simple, unplanned, but it rooted deep. Clara's breath caught. Harlan didn't correct himself, and Liam didn't question it. The boy just grinned like the world made sense again. That night, Clara sat by the fire while Harlan carved a small wooden figure, another horse, finer than the first. The flames threw soft light across his face, and for a moment, he looked almost peaceful. "I keep thinking about that night," she said quietly. "About how close we came." He didn't look up. "Fire's meant to scare us, not stop us. But what if it's more than that? What if they want blood next time Harlan set down the knife? Then they'll find me waiting." She wanted to tell him not to fight, that she couldn't bear to lose another man to violence, but the words tangled with pride. He wasn't her husband, but he was something truer, a man who didn't need to be asked to stand beside her. 3 nights later, the real test came. Clara woke to the distant bark of the dog they kept behind the shed. Then came the crunch of boots outside. 1, maybe 2 men. Harlan was already awake. He rose from the chair by the hearth and pulled on his coat. "Stay inside," he whispered. She gripped his sleeve. "Don't." He pressed her hand once, firm and reassuring. "It's all right." He stepped out into the night. The air was brittle cold, moonlight spilling across the snow. 2 shapes moved near the fence line, shadows shifting. "Cole." A voice slurred through the dark. It was Cale Morris. "How's it feel? Playing house with a thief's widow." Harlan's voice was low and calm. "Go home." "Cale, you've had too much whiskey. You think you're better than us?" another man snarled. "You ain't fooling anyone. You want her, you marry her, or get out." Clara stood frozen at the door, every nerve taut. "I don't owe you or this town anything," Harlan said. Cale stepped forward, a glint catching in his hand. "Maybe you do." That was all it took. Harlan moved fast, catching Cale's wrist before the knife could rise. They grappled, the 2 of them crashing into the snow. The second man lunged forward, but a sharp crack split the air. Clara's voice shouting behind the rifle she held. "Enough." The men froze. She stood in the doorway, barrel steady, though her hands shook. "Go," she said. "Before I forget I'm better than you." Cale spat, face twisted with rage. "You'll regret this, both of you." "Maybe," she said, "but not tonight." They backed away, muttering, and disappeared into the trees. When silence returned, Clara lowered the rifle. Harlan was already beside her, breathing hard, a cut blooming red across his cheek. She reached for him without thinking, wiping the blood with her sleeve. "You could have been killed." He caught her wrist gently. "So could you." Her voice broke. "I'm so tired of being afraid." He held her gaze. "Then don't be. Not anymore." The wind swept across the porch, carrying the scent of smoke and pine. Harlan touched her face, his hand rough and trembling just enough to make it real. "Clara," he said, "I meant what I told Briggs. I'm not passing through. I want a life here with you, with the boy. If you'll have me." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I already do." He bent his head then, pressing his forehead to hers, and the world around them seemed to quiet. The cabin behind them still bore the marks of fire and struggle, but inside there was warmth, something stronger than fear. By summer, the barn was rebuilt. The fields near the creek shimmered with young corn, and wildflowers grew where ashes had fallen. When the preacher rode out from town, it wasn't for a sermon of scorn, but to bless a wedding beneath the cottonwoods. Clara wore a blue dress she had sewn herself. Liam stood beside Harlan, clutching the ring carved from a silver coin. There was no crowd, no music, only the river's murmur and the wind in the grass. When the vows were spoken, Harlan slipped the ring on her finger and said, "No fire, no winter, no man's word will take me from you." And she believed him. That night, after the sun fell and the stars spilled across the sky, Clara sat beside him on the porch. Liam slept inside, the sound of his breathing soft and sure. She looked out at the land, the barn, the endless stretch of hills, and whispered, "Do you think they'll ever stop talking?" Harlan smiled faintly. "Let them. The land will outlast their noise." She leaned against him then, her head resting on his shoulder. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying no judgment, only the quiet promise of peace earned, not given. And for the first time in years, Clara Whitmore felt truly home. Maybe the hardest thing in life isn't surviving hardship, but staying kind after the world has turned its back on you. Clara Whitmore thought she needed no one until Harlan Cole came along. He didn't save her out of pity. He stood beside her out of respect, reminding her and all of us that quiet decency is its own kind of courage. Their love wasn't made of grand promises or fancy words. It grew from small acts, a warm meal, a rebuilt roof, a hand offered in silence. It showed that healing doesn't come from miracles. It comes from kindness, persistence, and choosing to believe again. If you've ever lost your faith in people, let this story remind you goodness still exists. Maybe it doesn't shine bright, but it burns steady, enough to guide us through the longest winter nights. Clara and Harlan's story tells us one thing. Clearly, hope isn't something you wait for. It's something you build hand in hand, day by day, even when the wind blows cold. Thank you for riding with us through this tale of love, resilience, and redemption. If you believe the world still needs stories that heal, please like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts, where every story keeps one more light burning against the dark.